Report affirmative.
Waiting affirmative. Order. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Very well. Affirmative. 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 Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. At once. Affirmative. 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 Very well. Affirmative. Very well. Affirmative. Affirmative. Agreed. Affirmative.
Yes, acknowledged. Affirmative.
Waiting
Very
orders.
Well. Perfect. Acknowledged.
Ready and waiting. Yes, sir. Waiting orders. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Very well. At once. Affirmative.
Comrade. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Waiting
At
orders.
once.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Agreed. Very well.
Reinforcements have arrived.
Very well.
Waiting acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Reporting. Affirmative. Agreed.
Acknowledged.
Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Comrade. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Reporting. Affirmative. Very well. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. At once. At once. Affirmative. Affirmative. Very well. Agreed. At once. Very well. Affirmative. Very well. Affirmative. Agreed. Affirmative. At once. Agreed. Of course. Affirmative. 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 Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Very well. Affirmative. Affirmative. At once. Affirmative. Very well. Very well. Affirmative. Waiting orders. Yes, sir. Very well. At once. Affirmative. 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 Very well. Agreed. Yes, sir. At once. Agreed. Affirmative. Affirmative. Very well. At once. Agreed. Very well. At once. Report. Agreed. Very well. Yes, sir. Very well. Affirmative. At once.
Comrade. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Reporting. At once. Of course. Of course. Very well. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Very well.
Reinforcements
At
have
once.
arrived.
Affirmative.
First
Yes, sir.
objective met.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Affirmative. At once. Very well. At once. Affirmative. Ready and waiting. At once. Affirmative. Affirmative. Agreed. At once.
Waiting.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge.
Waiting.
Acknowledge.
Acknowledge.
Vehicle report. Affirmative.
Comrade. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Acknowledge.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Reporting.
Waiting order. Comrade. Report. Acknowledge.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge.
Reinforcements
Acknowledge.
have arrived.
Waiting order.
Vehicle acknowledge. Affirmative.
Report.
Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Waiting order. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Waiting order.
Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Vehicle affirmative.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Reporting.
Affirmative. Waiting order. Acknowledged. Comrade. Acknowledged. Comrade. Comrade. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Vehicle reporting.
Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Yes, affirmative. Waiting order.
Affirmative.
Reporting. Affirmative. Reporting.
Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Comrade, affirmative.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Waiting order. Affirmative.
Warning, 5
Yes, sir.
minutes.
Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged.
Comrade, acknowledged.
Reporting. Acknowledged.
Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Report. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Waiting order. Waiting order.
Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Warning, 4
Yes,
minutes
sir.
remaining.
Acknowledged. 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 Reporting. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Waiting order.
Acknowledged. Vehicle affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Report acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Warning, 3 minutes remaining.
Report
Naval
acknowledged.
unit lost. Naval unit lost.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Reporting. Affirmative. Awaiting. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Awaiting. Acknowledged.
Naval
Affirmative.
unit lost.
Reporting. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Warning, 2 minutes
Yes, sir.
remaining.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. 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 Report. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Comrade. Affirmative.
Warning, 1 minute remaining.
Affirmative. Comrade.
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Comrade. Acknowledged. Reporting.
Reinforcements have arrived.
Waiting order. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Reinforcements have arrived.
Vehicle reporting. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Reinforcements have arrived.
Waiting order. Affirmative. Reporting. Affirmative.
Vehicle reporting.
Waiting order.
Acknowledged.
Comrade. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Reporting.
Unit lost.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Waiting orders, of course. Very well. Agreed. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Unit lost. Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged.
Unit lost.
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes,
Unit
sir.
lost.
Affirmative, of course. Affirmative. 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 Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged.
Unit
Acknowledged.
lost.
At once.
Unit lost.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative.
Reinforcements have arrived.
Acknowledged.
Waiting orders. Very well.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged.
Charge! Let's go on!
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Reporting. Affirmative. Yes, sir. At once. Acknowledged. Agreed. Reporting. Very well. Affirmative.
Reporting. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Affirmative.
Very well. Affirmative. Reporting. At once. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Very well.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Waiting orders. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Unit lost.
Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Comrade.
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Unit lost. Unit
Vehicle
lost.
Fully charged.
Unit lost.
Yes, sir.
Unit lost.
Reporting.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Waiting order.
Very well. Yes, sir. At once. Very well. Affirmative.
Vehicle report. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Reporting. Acknowledged. Waiting order.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Waiting order. Acknowledged.
Waiting orders.
Fully charged. Fully charged. Let's start. Let's start.
Reporting. Affirmative.
Yes.
Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Comrade.
Waiting orders.
Affirmative.
Mission accomplished.